The scorching Florida sun beat down mercilessly on the pristine white sand of Clearwater Beach as wedding guests gathered under an elaborate archway of pink and white roses. It was August 15, 2019, and what appeared to be a perfect fairy tale wedding was about to unfold into one of the most shocking and heartbreaking stories of love, deception, and violence that would grip the nation. Amara Ben Ali, a stunning 24-year-old from Casablanca, Morocco, stood radiant in her flowing ivory gown, her dark eyes sparkling with what seemed like pure joy as she gazed at her American groom. The delicate henna patterns on her hands told stories of ancient traditions, while her nervous smile hinted at secrets that would soon shatter everything. Beside her stood Jackson Whitmore, a 31-year-old real estate developer from Tampa, his sun-kissed skin and confident demeanor making him the picture of American success. His family had money, influence, and expectations that weighed heavily on his broad shoulders. To everyone watching, they were the perfect couple, a beautiful blend of cultures coming together in the land of opportunity. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of cultural fusion. Amara's traditional Moroccan kaftan had been carefully preserved for the reception, while her white wedding dress satisfied Jackson's family's more conventional expectations. The imam who performed the ceremony spoke eloquently about love transcending borders, about two souls finding each other across continents. Jackson's mother, Patricia Whitmore, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether from joy or concern was unclear. She had always been protective of her only son, and this foreign bride with her exotic beauty and mysterious past made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Jackson's father, Robert Whitmore, a prominent businessman in Tampa's construction industry, smiled broadly for the cameras, but his eyes held the calculating look of a man who was always assessing potential risks and benefits. The couple had met 18 months earlier when Jackson was in Morocco on a business trip, exploring opportunities for his family's real estate empire to expand into international markets. Amara had been working as a translator for a tourism company in Marrakesh, her fluent English and French making her invaluable to foreign visitors. Their first encounter was at a bustling marketplace where Jackson had become hopelessly lost trying to navigate the maze-like streets of the Medina. Amara had appeared like an angel, her flowing traditional dress and warm smile immediately captivating him as she offered to help. What started as a simple act of kindness blossomed into long conversations over mint tea, walks through ancient gardens, and eventually a whirlwind romance that seemed to bridge not just two hearts but two entirely different worlds. Jackson had been immediately drawn to Amara's intelligence and grace. She spoke passionately about her dreams of becoming a software engineer, her eyes lighting up when she discussed technology and innovation. In conservative Morocco, her ambitions were often met with skepticism, but Jackson encouraged her dreams, promising her that in America she could become anything she wanted. Amara, for her part, was enchanted by Jackson's confidence and his promises of a life filled with freedom and opportunity. She had grown up in a traditional family where certain aspects of her identity had always felt constrained, where she had learned to hide parts of herself that didn't fit into the narrow expectations of her society. America represented not just love but liberation. Their courtship had been conducted largely through video calls and messages after Jackson returned to Florida. He sent her flowers, expensive gifts, and most importantly, the immigration paperwork that would allow her to join him in the United States. Amara's family had been initially skeptical of this American suitor, but Jackson's obvious wealth and his respectful approach to their traditions eventually won them over. Her father, Hassan Ben Ali, a shopkeeper in Casablanca's Old Quarter, saw in Jackson an opportunity for his daughter to escape the limitations that had constrained women in their family for generations. Her mother, Fatima, worried about her daughter moving so far away but was reassured by Jackson's promises to honor Amara's faith and cultural background. The visa process had been lengthy and complicated, requiring extensive documentation and interviews that sometimes left Amara feeling exposed and vulnerable. There were medical examinations, background checks, and countless forms that seemed to probe into every aspect of her life. During one particularly stressful interview at the American consulate in Casablanca, Amara had been asked detailed questions about her past, her family, and her intentions in America. She had answered truthfully about most things, but there were aspects of her personal history that she kept private, not out of deception, but out of a deep-seated fear that the truth might complicate her chances of building a new life with the man she loved. When Amara finally arrived in Tampa 6 months before their wedding, she was overwhelmed by the sprawling city, the endless highways, and the casual way Americans interacted with each other. Jackson had prepared a beautiful apartment for her in downtown Tampa, complete with a view of the Hillsborough River and all the modern amenities she could want. He enrolled her in English classes to help her perfect her accent, though her English was already remarkably good. He also connected her with a local mosque where she could maintain her religious practices, showing a level of cultural sensitivity that made her fall even deeper in love with him. The months leading up to their wedding were filled with planning, shopping, and the gradual process of Amara adapting to American life. She marveled at the freedom women had in Florida, the way they could drive cars, work in any profession, and express their opinions openly. She began taking online courses in computer programming, working toward her dream of becoming a software engineer. Jackson supported her ambitions enthusiastically, often bragging to his friends about his brilliant fiancée who spoke 4 languages and could code in Python and JavaScript. To the outside world, they seemed like a couple perfectly matched in their ambitions and their love for each other. But beneath the surface of this perfect romance, Amara carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. In Morocco, she had lived a carefully constructed life, presenting herself as the person she knew she truly was while hiding the biological reality that had complicated her existence since birth. The transition had been gradual and private, supported by a small network of understanding friends and a progressive doctor in Casablanca who had helped her access hormone therapy. Her legal documents had been changed through a complex process that had taken years to complete, and by the time she met Jackson, Amara Ben Ali existed fully and completely as the woman she had always known herself to be. The decision not to tell Jackson about her transgender identity had not been made lightly. In the early days of their relationship, she had convinced herself that it was ancient history, irrelevant to the woman she had become and the life they were building together. As their relationship deepened, the window for revelation seemed to close, and she found herself trapped between her love for Jackson and her fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to build. She told herself that her past didn't define her, that the woman Jackson loved was real and authentic, regardless of the circumstances of her birth. As their wedding day approached, Amara's anxiety grew. She confided in Layla Kassim, her closest friend from the local Moroccan community in Tampa, a woman who had immigrated to America 5 years earlier and understood the complexities of building a new identity in a foreign land. Layla had noticed Amara's nervousness and had gently probed about its source, but Amara had been unable to bring herself to share the full truth, even with someone she trusted. Instead, she spoke vaguely about fears of not being good enough for Jackson's family, about worries that she would never truly fit into American society. The wedding reception was held at the prestigious Vinoy Renaissance Resort in St. Petersburg, with over 200 guests celebrating under the stars. The menu featured both American classics and Moroccan specialties, and the music alternated between contemporary hits and traditional North African melodies. Jackson's business associates mingled with Amara's new friends from the immigrant community, creating a vibrant tapestry of cultures and languages. Amara moved through the crowd like a queen, her beauty and grace captivating everyone she met. She danced with Jackson's elderly grandfather, charmed his business partners with her intelligence, and even managed to win over some of his more skeptical relatives with her warmth and genuine interest in their lives. Jackson himself was in his element, proud to show off his exotic bride and basking in the admiration of his guests. He had always been competitive, always needing to have the best of everything, and Amara represented the ultimate prize in his mind. She was beautiful, intelligent, cultured, and completely devoted to him. His friends envied him, his business rivals respected him more, and his family, despite their initial reservations, seemed to be warming to their new daughter-in-law. As the evening progressed and the champagne flowed, Jackson felt like he was living in a dream, surrounded by everything he had ever wanted. The couple's first dance was to a song that had special meaning for them, a melody that Jackson had heard playing in a cafe in Marrakesh during one of their early dates. As they swayed together under the Florida stars, Amara whispered words of love in Arabic that made Jackson's heart race, even though he didn't understand their meaning. The photographer captured every moment, creating images that would later seem almost surreal in their perfection, like scenes from a movie about a love that was too good to be true. As the night wound down and the last guest departed, Jackson and Amara retreated to the honeymoon suite that overlooked Tampa Bay. The room was filled with rose petals and champagne, a romantic setting that should have been the perfect beginning to their married life. But as Amara stood on the balcony looking out at the glittering lights of the city, She felt a growing sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Tomorrow they would begin their life as husband and wife, and she knew that the foundation of their relationship was built on an omission that could destroy everything they had built together. Jackson joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arms around her from behind and nuzzling her neck. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered, testing out her new name. "I love the sound of that." Amara leaned back against him, drawing strength from his warmth and trying to push away the voice in her head that whispered warnings about the future. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. In that moment, surrounded by love and luxury, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her secret could remain buried forever, and they could build a happy life together based on the love they shared and the dreams they had for their future. The first months of married life passed like a beautiful dream that Amara desperately wanted to believe would never end. Jackson had surprised her with a stunning waterfront home in the exclusive Bayshore Boulevard area of Tampa, complete with a private dock and panoramic views of Hillsborough Bay. The house was everything Amara had ever imagined when she dreamed of her new life in America, with its soaring ceilings, marble countertops, and floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with golden Florida sunshine. She spent her days decorating their new home, carefully blending Jackson's modern American tastes with touches of Moroccan elegance that reminded her of her heritage. Intricate lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, while colorful textiles and handcrafted pottery added warmth to the sleek contemporary spaces. Jackson seemed genuinely happy during those early weeks, proudly showing off their home to friends and business associates who came for dinner parties and weekend gatherings. He loved introducing Amara as his wife, watching as men envied him and women complimented her beauty and grace. At these social events, Amara played her role perfectly, charming guests with stories about Morocco while demonstrating her growing knowledge of American culture and business. She had enrolled in advanced computer science courses at the University of South Florida, working toward her dream of becoming a software engineer, and Jackson often bragged about his brilliant wife who could code complex algorithms while preparing traditional tagines that left their guests begging for recipes. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, subtle changes began to emerge in Jackson's behavior that made Amara increasingly uncomfortable. What had initially seemed like protective concern gradually revealed itself as possessive control. He began questioning her daily activities with an intensity that felt more like interrogation than loving interest. When she mentioned grabbing coffee with Layla or attending study groups at the university, Jackson would pepper her with questions about who else was there, what they discussed, and why she needed to spend time with other people when she had everything she needed at home. His questions were always delivered with a smile and framed as concern for her safety and well-being, but Amara could sense an underlying tension that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The first real warning sign came when Jackson suggested that Amara might be happier focusing on their home and their future family rather than pursuing her computer science degree. "You're so talented at creating a beautiful home," he said one evening as they sat on their terrace watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of orange and pink. "And you know how much I want children. Maybe it's time to focus on what really matters." When Amara gently reminded him that her education had always been important to her, that he had encouraged her dreams when they first met, Jackson's expression darkened for just a moment before he forced another smile. "Of course, sweetheart. I just want you to be happy. But don't you think you're already living the American dream? You have a beautiful home, a husband who adores you, and unlimited opportunities. What more could you want?" The conversation left Amara feeling unsettled and confused. In Morocco, she had dreamed of the freedom that American women enjoyed, the ability to pursue any career and make their own choices about their lives. But Jackson's vision of her future seemed to involve trading one set of limitations for another, albeit more luxurious ones. She tried to push these concerns aside, telling herself that Jackson was just being protective, that his traditional views about marriage and family were common among successful American men. After all, he had rescued her from a life of limited opportunities in Morocco and given her everything she had ever wanted. Surely she owed him some consideration of his wishes for their future together. As autumn arrived in Florida, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the promise of relief from the oppressive summer heat, Jackson's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began coming home from work in dark moods, complaining about stress from his real estate projects and pressure from his father to expand the family business more aggressively. He started drinking more heavily, often polishing off an entire bottle of wine with dinner and then switching to whiskey as the evening progressed. When Amara expressed concern about his drinking, Jackson would become defensive and sometimes hostile, accusing her of being ungrateful and not understanding the pressures he faced as the sole provider for their household. The first time Jackson raised his voice at her, Amara was so shocked that she simply stood frozen in their kitchen, unable to process what was happening. They had been discussing her desire to apply for an internship at a local tech company, and Jackson had exploded with unexpected fury. "You're my wife," he had shouted, his face flushed red with anger and alcohol. "Your job is to support me and build our family, not to go running around with a bunch of strangers who don't know anything about our life together." The outburst lasted only a few minutes before Jackson seemed to realize what he had done, immediately apologizing and blaming his behavior on work stress and too much wine. He held Amara close, stroking her hair and whispering apologies until she convinced herself that it had been an isolated incident brought on by temporary pressures. But the incidents became more frequent and more intense as the weeks passed. Jackson began monitoring Amara's phone calls and text messages, always with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt increasingly invasive. He installed security cameras throughout their home, ostensibly for protection but positioned in ways that allowed him to monitor Amara's activities even when he wasn't there. When she questioned these measures, Jackson would remind her that she was a beautiful foreign woman in a new country, that there were dangerous people who might try to take advantage of her innocence and vulnerability. His explanations always contained just enough truth to make Amara doubt her own instincts about his motivations. The isolation began gradually, so subtly that Amara didn't recognize it until it was nearly complete. Jackson started finding reasons why she couldn't attend social events with her friends from the Moroccan community. Layla was a bad influence who filled her head with feminist ideas that were incompatible with a happy marriage. The study groups at the university were full of young men who might misinterpret her friendliness. Even her online classes became a source of conflict, with Jackson arguing that she was spending too much time staring at computer screens when she should be focusing on their relationship and their home. One particularly difficult evening in November, Jackson came home to find Amara video chatting with her parents in Casablanca. The conversation was in Arabic, and although Jackson had never expressed interest in learning her language, he seemed suspicious of any communication he couldn't understand. After her parents ended the call, Jackson demanded to know what they had discussed, his tone suggesting that he suspected some kind of conspiracy or deception. When Amara explained that her mother was simply asking about their life in America and expressing hopes for grandchildren, Jackson's expression softened, but she could see that he remained troubled by his inability to monitor and control every aspect of her communication with the outside world. The pressure to start a family became a constant source of tension between them. Jackson spoke frequently about his desire for children, particularly sons who could carry on the Whitmore family name and eventually take over the business empire his father had built. He had already begun making plans for converting one of their spare bedrooms into a nursery, and he often made comments about how beautiful their children would be, combining his American strength with her exotic Moroccan features. These conversations filled Amara with a dread that she couldn't fully explain to herself, a deep-seated fear that went beyond normal anxiety about pregnancy and motherhood. During their most intimate moments, Amara found herself becoming increasingly anxious and withdrawn. She had become expert over the years at navigating physical relationships while protecting her privacy, but Jackson's growing possessiveness made these encounters feel more like examinations than expressions of love. He seemed to be studying her body with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, asking questions about scars and physical characteristics that she deflected with carefully prepared explanations about childhood accidents and cultural differences in personal grooming. Each intimate encounter left her feeling more vulnerable and exposed, as if Jackson was slowly peeling away the layers of protection she had built around her true identity. The breaking point came on a cold December evening when Jackson returned home early from a business dinner, clearly intoxicated and in a foul mood. He had been drinking with potential investors who had ultimately decided not to fund his latest development project, and he was looking for someone to blame for his professional disappointments. Amara was in their home office, working on a programming assignment for one of her online courses, when Jackson burst through the door demanding to know why she wasn't waiting for him in the living room like a proper wife should. The argument that followed was unlike anything they had experienced before. Jackson's anger seemed to come from a place of deep frustration and resentment that had been building for months. He accused Amara of being selfish and ungrateful, of taking advantage of his generosity while refusing to fulfill her obligations as his wife. He demanded to know why she hadn't gotten pregnant yet, suggesting that she might be deliberately preventing conception because she cared more about her stupid computer classes than about building a family with him. His words became increasingly cruel and personal, attacking not just her priorities but her worth as a woman and a wife. When Amara tried to defend herself, explaining that she needed time to adjust to married life and that pregnancy was something they should plan together, Jackson's rage reached a new level. He grabbed her laptop and slammed it shut, declaring that her education was over and that she would focus entirely on being the wife he needed her to be. The physical aggression was brief but shocking, and for the first time since arriving in America, Amara felt truly afraid of the man she had married. Jackson seemed to realize immediately that he had crossed the line, and he spent the rest of the evening apologizing and promising that it would never happen again, but the damage had been done. That night, as Jackson slept off his alcohol-fueled rage, Amara lay awake staring at the ceiling and finally acknowledging the truth she had been avoiding for months. Her marriage was not the fairy tale romance she had believed it to be, and Jackson was not the loving, supportive partner who would help her build the life she had dreamed of in America. Instead, she found herself trapped in a relationship with a man whose love was conditional on her complete submission to his will, whose protection came at the cost of her independence and autonomy. The beautiful house that had once seemed like a palace now felt like a prison, and the man sleeping beside her had revealed himself to be not a prince but a captor who would never allow her to be truly free. As she listened to the gentle lapping of waves against their private dock and watched the lights of Tampa twinkle in the distance, Amara began to formulate a plan for reclaiming her life and her dreams. She knew that leaving Jackson would not be easy, that he would use his wealth and connections to make her life difficult, but she also knew that staying would mean sacrificing everything she had hoped to achieve in America. The secret she carried about her past suddenly seemed less important than the truth about her present, and she realized that her transgender identity was just one of many aspects of herself that Jackson would never accept or understand. The winter months in Florida brought an uneasy calm to the Whitmore household, like the deceptive stillness before a devastating hurricane. Jackson seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship after his violent outburst, and he made elaborate efforts to win back Amara's trust and affection. He surprised her with expensive jewelry, planned romantic weekend getaways to Key West and Miami, and even suggested they take a trip to Morocco so he could meet her extended family and see the country that had shaped the woman he claimed to love. But beneath his charming gestures, Amara could feel his watchful eyes constantly monitoring her reactions, analyzing her responses for signs of disloyalty or deception. The surveillance had become more sophisticated and invasive. Jackson hired a private security company to upgrade their home system, installing cameras in every room except the bathrooms, which he claimed was for their protection against potential burglars who might target their wealthy neighborhood. He also insisted that Amara carry a new smartphone that he had purchased for her, explaining that her old phone had been acting unreliably and that he wanted to ensure she could always reach him in case of emergency. What he didn't tell her was that the new device was equipped with tracking software that allowed him to monitor her location, her calls, her messages, and even her internet browsing history in real time. Amara's isolation became nearly complete as Jackson systematically eliminated her connections to the outside world. He convinced her to stop attending classes at the university by arguing that the commute was dangerous and that she could learn everything she needed through online courses that he would personally select for her. When Layla called to invite her to a community gathering at the local mosque, Jackson intercepted the call and politely explained that Amara was feeling unwell and wouldn't be able to attend. He began answering her phone regularly, always with plausible explanations about protecting her from telemarketers or helping her practice English by handling difficult conversations. The pressure to conceive a child intensified dramatically as Jackson became obsessed with the idea of starting a family. He scheduled an appointment with a fertility specialist without consulting Amara, presenting it as a routine checkup that all responsible couples should have when planning for children. When Amara expressed reluctance about the appointment, Jackson's reaction was swift and frightening. His voice remained calm and controlled, but his eyes held a coldness that made her blood freeze. "Amara, sweetheart," he said with deliberate precision, "we've been married for 6 months now. It's time to stop playing games and start building the family we both want. Unless there's something you're not telling me about why you can't get pregnant." The appointment was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, and as the date approached, Amara felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. She knew that any medical examination would reveal the truth about her biological history, and she also knew that Jackson's reaction to that revelation would be catastrophic. She had seen glimpses of his capacity for violence, and she understood that his sense of masculine pride and social status would never survive the perceived humiliation of discovering that his exotic bride was transgender. The man who had seemed so progressive and accepting when they first met had revealed himself to be deeply traditional and controlling, someone who viewed her as a possession rather than a partner. 3 days before the scheduled appointment, Amara made a desperate decision that would change everything. She had been secretly saving money from the household allowance Jackson gave her, hiding small amounts in a safety deposit box she had opened using her maiden name at a bank across town. She had also been researching women's shelters and legal aid organizations that helped immigrants in abusive relationships, though she had been careful to clear her browser history and use public computers at the library when Jackson thought she was shopping or running errands. On that Tuesday morning, while Jackson was at a construction site meeting that she knew would last several hours, Amara packed a small bag with essential documents, some clothes, and the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. She left behind the expensive gifts Jackson had given her, taking only what was truly hers. In a letter she placed on their bed, she tried to explain her decision without revealing the secret that had made their marriage impossible. She wrote about feeling trapped and controlled, about missing her independence and her dreams of building a career in technology. She apologized for any pain she was causing him and asked him to understand that she needed space to figure out who she was in America, separate from being his wife. What Amara didn't anticipate was that Jackson would return home early from his meeting, having received a call from the security company about unusual activity in their house. The motion sensors had detected movement in their bedroom during hours when Amara should have been in the kitchen preparing lunch, and Jackson's paranoia immediately kicked into high gear. He arrived home to find Amara's letter and evidence of her hasty departure, and his reaction was immediate and explosive. He called her phone repeatedly, leaving increasingly threatening voicemails when she didn't answer. He contacted the private investigator he had used for business purposes, demanding that the man drop everything and locate his missing wife immediately. Amara had taken refuge at a women's shelter in St. Petersburg, a nondescript building that provided temporary housing for women fleeing domestic violence. The intake counselor, a compassionate woman named Diana Rodriguez, listened to Amara's story with growing concern, recognizing the classic patterns of escalating abuse and control. Diana helped Amara understand her legal rights as an immigrant spouse and connected her with an attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases involving foreign nationals. For the first time in months, Amara felt like she could breathe freely, surrounded by women who understood her situation and supported her decision to leave. But Jackson's resources and determination proved formidable. Within 48 hours, his private investigator had tracked Amara to the shelter, and Jackson began a campaign of harassment that tested the limits of legal intervention. He sent flowers and expensive gifts to the shelter, along with handwritten notes begging Amara to come home and promising that things would be different. He hired a team of lawyers to explore his options for forcing her return, arguing that she had abandoned their marriage without cause and that her immigration status might be in jeopardy if she didn't fulfill her obligations as his spouse. The shelter staff had seen this pattern before, and they worked quickly to help Amara develop a safety plan and explore her legal options. The attorney, Maria Santos, explained that Amara's immigration status was actually more secure than Jackson was claiming, and that she had rights under federal domestic violence laws that protected immigrant women from deportation when they left abusive relationships. But Maria also warned that Jackson's wealth and connections would make the legal battle complicated and potentially dangerous. Jackson's public campaign to win back his wife was carefully orchestrated to present him as a loving husband whose foreign bride had been confused by bad influences and cultural misunderstandings. He gave interviews to local media outlets, describing Amara as a vulnerable woman who had been manipulated by radical feminists who didn't understand the beauty of traditional marriage. He spoke eloquently about cultural differences and the challenges of helping an immigrant wife adjust to American life, painting himself as a patient and devoted husband who was being unfairly punished for his efforts to protect and provide for the woman he loved. The media attention made Amara's situation even more precarious. Her photo appeared in newspapers and on television, making it impossible for her to move freely without being recognized. Jackson's version of events was compelling to many viewers who saw a successful American man being abandoned by an ungrateful foreign wife who had used him for immigration benefits. The narrative played into existing prejudices about immigrant women and mail-order brides, and public opinion began to turn against Amara even though the full truth of her situation remained hidden. As February turned into March, the pressure on Amara intensified from multiple directions. Jackson's lawyers filed motions demanding that she return to their shared home and participate in marriage counseling, arguing that her departure constituted abandonment and that she was violating the terms of her immigration status. The fertility specialist's office called repeatedly, insisting that she keep her appointment and threatening to report her non-compliance to Jackson's insurance company. Most disturbing of all, Amara began to notice that she was being followed by men in dark cars who seemed to be monitoring her movements whenever she left the shelter. The breaking point came when Jackson appeared at the shelter himself, arriving with a bouquet of roses and a team of lawyers who demanded to speak with his wife. The confrontation in the shelter's lobby was tense and frightening, with Jackson alternating between tearful pleas for reconciliation and barely controlled threats about the consequences of her continued defiance. He spoke about the shame she was bringing to both their families, the damage she was doing to his reputation and business relationships, and the legal trouble she would face if she continued to refuse his reasonable requests for communication and counseling. During this confrontation, something in Jackson's demeanor shifted in a way that made Amara's blood run cold. His mask of civilized concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "I know there's something you're not telling me, Amara," he said with quiet intensity that was more frightening than any shouting. "I've always known there was something different about you, something you've been hiding. But I'm going to find out what it is, and when I do, you'll realize that running away was the biggest mistake of your life." That night, as Amara lay in her narrow bed at the shelter listening to the sounds of other women dealing with their own nightmares, she realized that her secret was no longer just about protecting her privacy or avoiding difficult conversations. Jackson's obsession with uncovering the truth about her past had become dangerous, and she knew that when he eventually discovered her transgender identity, his reaction would be violent and potentially deadly. The man who had once promised to love and protect her had revealed himself to be someone who viewed her as a puzzle to be solved, a possession to be controlled, and ultimately a threat to be eliminated. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Diana Rodriguez pulled Amara aside after breakfast to inform her that Jackson had hired a team of private investigators who were conducting an extensive background check into her life in Morocco. They had already contacted her former employer in Marrakesh, her university in Casablanca, and even some of her childhood neighbors, asking detailed questions about her past and offering money for information about her personal history. It was only a matter of time before they uncovered the truth about her transition, and when that happened, Amara knew that Jackson's campaign against her would escalate from harassment to something far more dangerous. The investigation into Amara's past moved with the ruthless efficiency that only money could buy. Jackson had spared no expense in hiring Blackstone Investigations, a firm that specialized in corporate espionage and personal background checks for wealthy clients who demanded absolute discretion and thorough results. The lead investigator, a former FBI agent named Thomas Crawford, had connections throughout law enforcement and immigration services that allowed him to access records that would normally remain confidential. Within a week of beginning their investigation, Crawford's team had assembled a comprehensive dossier on Amara's life in Morocco that painted a picture Jackson was not prepared to see. The first breakthrough came when investigators interviewed Dr. Khalid Mansouri, the progressive physician in Casablanca who had supervised Amara's hormone therapy and transition process. Dr. Mansouri initially refused to discuss his former patient, citing medical confidentiality, but when the investigators offered a substantial payment and suggested that American authorities were investigating potential immigration fraud, he reluctantly confirmed that he had treated a patient named Rajesh Ben Ali for gender dysphoria over a period of 3 years. The revelation that his wife had been born male hit Jackson like a physical blow, shattering his carefully constructed image of their perfect marriage and sending him into a rage that terrified even his own employees. Crawford delivered the news to Jackson in his downtown Tampa office on a gray March afternoon, presenting a thick folder of documents, photographs, and witness statements that told the complete story of Amara's transition from Rajesh to the woman Jackson had married. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. from medical records showing hormone treatments to legal documents detailing the name and gender changes that had been processed through Morocco's surprisingly progressive transgender rights laws. There were even photographs from Amara's university years that showed the gradual physical changes as she became more comfortable expressing her true identity. Jackson's initial reaction was complete denial, insisting that the investigators had made a mistake or been deceived by false documents. But as Crawford methodically walked him through each piece of evidence, explaining how the timeline matched perfectly with Amara's known biography, Jackson's denial transformed into something far more dangerous. The humiliation he felt was not just personal but professional and social, as he realized that his business associates, his family, and his entire social circle would soon learn that he had been deceived by what he could only conceptualize as an elaborate fraud perpetrated by someone he now refused to acknowledge as a woman. The revelation recontextualized every aspect of their relationship in Jackson's mind, transforming what he had believed to be a love story into what he now saw as a calculated deception designed to humiliate him and steal his wealth. He became obsessed with the idea that Amara had specifically targeted him, that she had researched his background and manipulated their meeting in Morocco to trap him into marriage with someone who was fundamentally different from what she had claimed to be. The fact that Amara's transition had been completed years before they met, that her legal documents were entirely legitimate, and that she had built a successful life as a woman in Morocco meant nothing to Jackson's wounded pride and growing paranoia. Within hours of receiving Crawford's report, Jackson was on the phone with his attorney, demanding to know what legal options he had for pursuing criminal charges against Amara. The lawyer, a seasoned professional named Richard Blackwood who had handled numerous high-profile divorces for wealthy clients, tried to explain that Amara had not actually committed any crimes under Florida or federal law. Her immigration documents were legitimate, her marriage license was valid, and there was no legal requirement for transgender individuals to disclose their medical history to romantic partners. But Jackson was not interested in legal nuances or civil rights protections. He wanted revenge against the person who had made him feel foolish and betrayed. The harassment campaign that followed was systematic and relentless. Jackson used his wealth and connections to make Amara's life in Tampa impossible, pressuring the women's shelter to evict her by threatening to withdraw his family's charitable donations and suggesting that harboring a fraud might jeopardize their nonprofit status. When the shelter staff refused to abandon Amara, Jackson escalated his tactics, hiring protesters to demonstrate outside the building with signs claiming that the facility was protecting criminals and deceiving the public about the true nature of domestic violence. The media campaign Jackson orchestrated was particularly cruel and effective. He leaked selected portions of Crawford's investigation to sympathetic journalists, framing the story as an exposé of immigration fraud and marriage deception rather than a case of domestic violence against a transgender woman. The local news coverage focused on Jackson as a victim of an elaborate con game, with reporters interviewing his friends and family members who expressed shock and sympathy for the successful businessman who had been so cruelly deceived. Amara's transgender identity was presented not as a personal characteristic deserving of respect and protection, but as evidence of her fundamental dishonesty and criminal intent. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Social media exploded with commentary about the case, much of it reflecting deep-seated prejudices about transgender people and immigrant women. Amara received death threats through various channels, with anonymous callers and message senders expressing outrage that she had dared to deceive an American man and demanding that she be deported immediately. The local transgender community rallied to support her, but their voices were drowned out by the chorus of anger and disgust that Jackson's media campaign had unleashed. If you found this story compelling and want to see more content like this, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. As the pressure mounted, Amara's legal situation became increasingly precarious. Jackson's lawyers filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for fraud and emotional distress, arguing that Amara had deliberately concealed material information that would have prevented their marriage. They also contacted immigration authorities, suggesting that Amara's failure to disclose her transgender status on her visa applications constituted fraud that should result in deportation proceedings. While these legal challenges were unlikely to succeed given existing civil rights protections, they created a cloud of uncertainty and fear that made it difficult for Amara to plan for her future or find stable housing and employment. The psychological toll of Jackson's campaign was devastating. Amara had fled Morocco partly to escape the limitations and prejudices that had constrained her life there, only to find herself facing even more virulent hatred and discrimination in the country she had believed would offer her freedom and opportunity. The women's shelter provided some protection and support, but the constant media attention and legal threats made it impossible for her to rebuild her life or pursue her dreams of working in technology. She spent her days in hiding, afraid to venture outside for fear of being recognized and harassed by strangers who had been inflamed by Jackson's propaganda. The breaking point came in early April when Jackson's investigators discovered the location of the new safe house where Amara had been moved after the original shelter became too dangerous. The address was leaked to Jackson's supporters, and within hours the building was surrounded by angry protesters demanding that Amara be arrested and deported. The demonstration turned violent when some participants began throwing rocks at the windows and trying to force their way into the building, requiring police intervention to restore order and ensure the safety of the women inside. That night, as Amara huddled in a darkened room listening to the angry voices outside, she received a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Detective Michael Torres from the Tampa Police Department, and he explained that Jackson had filed a formal complaint alleging that Amara had committed marriage fraud and identity theft. While the detective emphasized that these were civil rather than criminal matters, he requested that Amara come to the police station for questioning to provide her side of the story and help clarify the legal situation. Amara's attorney, Maria Santos, strongly advised against cooperating with the police interview, arguing that Jackson was using law enforcement to intimidate and harass his estranged wife. But Amara was exhausted by months of hiding and running, and she desperately wanted an opportunity to tell her story to someone in authority who might be able to help her find a path forward. Against her lawyer's advice, she agreed to meet with Detective Torres the following morning, hoping that a calm and rational conversation might help defuse the increasingly dangerous situation. The police station interview was supposed to be a routine fact-finding session, but Jackson had other plans. Using his connections in the business community, he had arranged for several prominent Tampa citizens to be present at the station that morning, ostensibly for unrelated meetings but actually to witness Amara's arrival and create additional media attention. When Amara and her attorney arrived at the police station, they were greeted by a crowd of reporters and photographers who had been tipped off about the interview, creating a chaotic scene that made Amara feel like a criminal being perp-walked for the cameras. Detective Torres conducted the interview professionally, asking straightforward questions about Amara's background, her marriage to Jackson, and the circumstances of their separation. Amara answered honestly about her transition, her legal name change, and her reasons for leaving Jackson, emphasizing that she had never committed any crimes and that her only goal had been to build a peaceful life in America. But even as she spoke, she could see the skepticism in the detective's eyes, the way he seemed to view her transgender identity as inherently suspicious rather than simply a fact of her personal history. The interview concluded without any charges being filed, but the damage had been done. The media coverage of Amara's appearance at the police station reinforced Jackson's narrative that she was a criminal who had deceived law enforcement as well as her husband. The photographs of her entering the station in handcuffs, which had been staged for dramatic effect even though she was not under arrest, appeared on the front pages of local newspapers and went viral on social media, cementing her image as a dangerous fraud who had manipulated the American immigration system. That evening, as Amara sat in her temporary shelter room watching the news coverage of her police interview, she realized that Jackson's campaign had succeeded in destroying not just her marriage but her entire life in America. The country that had once represented freedom and opportunity now felt like a trap, with every institution and authority figure seemingly aligned against her. She had become a symbol of everything that certain Americans feared about immigration and social change, and Jackson had successfully weaponized those fears to turn her into a pariah who could never find peace or safety in the land she had hoped to call home. The final phase of Jackson's revenge was about to begin, and Amara sensed that her very survival might depend on decisions she would make in the coming days. The man who had once promised to love and protect her had revealed himself to be her most dangerous enemy, someone who would stop at nothing to punish her for the crime of being herself in a world that demanded she be someone else. The final confrontation began on a sweltering April evening when Jackson's patience with legal proceedings and media manipulation finally ran out. For weeks, he had watched Amara evade his attempts to force her back into his control, and his obsession had evolved into something far more dangerous than wounded pride or legal revenge. He had begun to see Amara not just as a deceptive wife but as a fundamental threat to everything he believed about himself, his masculinity, and his place in the world. The idea that he had been intimate with someone who had been born male consumed his thoughts day and night, driving him to increasingly desperate measures to restore what he saw as his damaged honor. Jackson's behavior had become erratic enough to concern even his closest associates. His business partners noticed that he was drinking heavily during meetings, making poor decisions about investments, and talking obsessively about his personal situation when he should have been focusing on work. His father, Robert Whitmore, tried to intervene, suggesting that Jackson should simply divorce Amara quietly and move on with his life, but Jackson's response was explosive and frightening. "You don't understand what she did to me," he screamed at his father during a family dinner that ended with Jackson storming out and not speaking to his parents for days. "She made me into something I'm not. She violated everything I am as a man." The private investigators Jackson had hired were becoming uncomfortable with their clients' increasingly unstable demands. Thomas Crawford had completed his background investigation and provided a comprehensive report, but Jackson kept demanding more invasive surveillance of Amara's daily activities, more detailed information about her supporters, and more aggressive tactics to isolate her from potential allies. When Crawford suggested that Jackson might want to consider therapy to help him process his feelings about the situation, Jackson fired him immediately and hired a less scrupulous firm that was willing to engage in activities that bordered on stalking and harassment. Amara's situation had become desperate as Jackson's campaign succeeded in making her life in Tampa impossible. The women's shelter could no longer guarantee her safety, and the constant media attention made it difficult for her to find alternative housing or employment. Her attorney, Maria Santos, had been working to arrange for Amara to relocate to another state where she might be able to start over, but Jackson's legal challenges and immigration complaints had created bureaucratic obstacles that delayed any potential move. Amara felt trapped in a nightmare where every day brought new threats and humiliations, and she began to wonder if she would ever be free of the man who had once claimed to love her. The breaking point came when Jackson discovered that Amara was planning to leave Florida with the help of a national organization that assisted transgender individuals facing persecution. His new investigators had been monitoring the communications of everyone in Amara's support network, and they intercepted messages about travel arrangements and safe house locations in other states. The idea that Amara might escape his reach entirely sent Jackson into a rage that his remaining friends and family members found genuinely frightening. He began talking about taking matters into his own hands, about ensuring that Amara would never be able to deceive another innocent man the way she had deceived him. On the evening of April 28, 2019, Jackson received a tip from one of his paid informants that Amara would be leaving her current safe house the following morning to meet with a representative from the relocation organization. The meeting was scheduled to take place at a small cafe in downtown St. Petersburg, a public location that Amara's supporters believed would provide safety through visibility. But Jackson saw this as his final opportunity to confront the woman who had destroyed his life and force her to face the consequences of her deception. Jackson spent that night drinking heavily and reviewing the evidence that Crawford's investigation had uncovered about Amara's past. He studied photographs from her transition, read medical records that detailed her hormone treatments, and obsessed over every detail of what he now saw as an elaborate fraud designed to humiliate him. By morning, his anger had crystallized into a cold determination to make Amara pay for what she had done to him, regardless of the legal or personal consequences he might face. The cafe where Amara was scheduled to meet her contact was a small, intimate space popular with local artists and students. She arrived early, hoping to scope out the location and ensure that she felt safe before the meeting began. She had been living in constant fear for months, and every public appearance felt like a risk, but she was desperate to escape Florida and start over somewhere that Jackson's influence couldn't reach her. She ordered a coffee and sat at a corner table where she could watch the entrance, her hands trembling slightly as she checked her phone for messages from her attorney and the relocation coordinator. Jackson arrived at the cafe 20 minutes after Amara, having watched from his car as she entered the building. He had been drinking since early morning, and his movements were slightly unsteady as he approached the entrance. He was carrying a leather briefcase that contained not just documents related to their marriage and divorce proceedings, but also a knife he had purchased the previous day from a hunting supply store. In his alcohol-clouded mind, he had convinced himself that he was going to force Amara to sign papers admitting her fraud and agreeing to leave the country voluntarily, but the knife represented his backup plan if she refused to cooperate. When Jackson entered the cafe, the few other customers immediately sensed the tension in the air. He was well-dressed but disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled and his hair uncombed, and there was something in his eyes that made people instinctively move away from him. Amara looked up from her phone and felt her blood freeze as she recognized her estranged husband approaching her table with an expression of cold fury that she had never seen before. She started to stand, thinking she might be able to escape through the back exit, but Jackson moved quickly to block her path. "Sit down, Rajesh," Jackson said loudly enough for everyone in the cafe to hear, using the name from Amara's past like a weapon designed to humiliate and expose her. "We need to have a conversation about what you've done to me and what you're going to do to make it right." His voice was slurred from alcohol but filled with a menacing intensity that made the other customers begin reaching for their phones to call for help. Amara remained standing, her heart pounding as she tried to assess her options for escape or self-defense. The confrontation escalated quickly as Jackson began shouting accusations and demands, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with each sentence. He accused Amara of being a fraud, a criminal, and a predator who had deliberately targeted him for financial gain. He demanded that she admit her deception publicly, that she signed documents confessing to immigration fraud, and that she agreed to leave the United States immediately. When Amara tried to speak, to explain that she had never intended to hurt him and that her identity was not a deception but simply who she was, Jackson's rage exploded into physical violence. The attack happened so quickly that the other customers barely had time to react. Jackson lunged across the table, grabbing Amara by the throat and screaming that she had made him into something he wasn't, that she had violated his masculinity and his honor in ways that could never be forgiven. Amara fought back desperately, trying to break free from his grip while calling for help, but Jackson was stronger and driven by months of accumulated rage and humiliation. He pulled the knife from his briefcase and held it against her neck, his hands shaking with fury as he continued to scream accusations and threats. The cafe erupted in chaos as customers fled toward the exits and others tried to call 911. A young barista named Kevin Martinez grabbed a baseball bat that the cafe kept behind the counter for security and tried to intervene, shouting at Jackson to let Amara go and step away from her. But Jackson was beyond reason, lost in a frenzy of violence that had been building for months. He turned the knife toward Kevin, slashing wildly and forcing the young man to retreat, before turning back to Amara with renewed fury. "You destroyed my life," Jackson screamed as he pressed the knife against Amara's throat, his face contorted with hatred and pain. "You made me sleep with a man. You made me into something disgusting. You took everything from me." Amara could feel the blade cutting into her skin, could see the madness in Jackson's eyes, and she knew that he intended to kill her. In that moment, she stopped fighting and spoke quietly, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos and reaching something human in Jackson's rage-consumed mind. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, blood trickling down her neck from where the knife had broken her skin. "I loved you. I thought you loved me too." For just a moment, Jackson's grip loosened and his expression wavered, as if he was remembering the man he had been when they first met in Morocco, when he had promised to love and protect her forever. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed fury as he raised the knife to deliver what he intended to be a fatal blow. The police arrived just as Jackson was preparing to strike, their sirens wailing as they surrounded the cafe and shouted commands through megaphones. The sight of armed officers seemed to break through Jackson's alcohol-fueled rage, and he suddenly realized the magnitude of what he was doing. He looked around the cafe at the terrified faces of the customers, at the blood on Amara's neck, at the knife in his own hand, and for the first time in months, he seemed to see the situation clearly. But instead of surrendering, Jackson made a final, desperate decision. "If I can't have you," he said to Amara with a calmness that was more terrifying than his previous rage, "then no one can." He turned the knife toward his own throat, his hand steady now as he prepared to end both their lives in a final act of possession and control. Amara screamed and tried to grab his arm, but Jackson was determined to have the last word in their tragic story. The knife found its mark before anyone could stop him, and Jackson collapsed to the cafe floor as blood pooled around his body. He died looking into Amara's eyes, his expression a mixture of hatred and something that might have been love, if love could be so twisted and destructive. Amara knelt beside him, her own wounds forgotten as she watched the life drain from the man who had once promised her everything and had ultimately given her nothing but pain and terror. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The media coverage focused on Jackson as a tragic figure driven to madness by deception, while Amara was portrayed as the catalyst for a senseless tragedy that had destroyed a prominent American family. She eventually received asylum protection and was able to relocate to another state, where she slowly rebuilt her life with the help of organizations that supported transgender immigrants. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal, and she would always carry the weight of knowing that her search for love and acceptance had led to such devastating consequences. Years later, Amara would sometimes wonder if there had been a moment when things could have gone differently, when honesty might have led to understanding rather than violence. But she also knew that Jackson's reaction had revealed something fundamental about his character that no amount of truth or explanation could have changed. In the end, their story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrets and the price of living authentically in a world that often punishes those who dare to be themselves. If this story moved you and you want to support more content that sheds light on important social issues, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that need to be heard.